On the morning of September 12, 1943, General Heinrich von Vietinghoff looked at the situation map of the Italian coast and saw what looked like a mathematical certainty. He was a Prussian officer of the old school, a man who believed in the tangible variables of war: elevation, armor thickness, division density, and supply lines. According to every rule of military doctrine he had studied for 30 years, he had already won. His 10th Army held the high ground, a ring of jagged limestone mountains looking down into the Gulf of Salerno like seats in a massive Roman amphitheater. Below him, trapped on a narrow, marshy strip of sand, less than 5 miles deep, was the U.S. 5th Army. To Vietinghoff's trained eye, they didn't look like an invasion force. They looked like a target practice. They were disorganized, pinned down against the water, and crucially, they had almost no heavy armor capable of matching his panzer divisions in open combat. Vietinghoff had the veteran 16th Panzer Division ready to strike. He had the element of surprise. He had the perfect terrain for a defensive slaughter, where every Allied movement was visible to his spotters in the hills. By all conventional logic, the American landing force should have been pushed back into the sea within 48 hours. The German High Command in Italy was already drafting the victory communique. They believed they were about to inflict a second Dunkirk on the Allies. The Allied landing at Salerno, Operation Avalanche, was a logistical nightmare from the moment the first boot hit the sand. The planners had made a critical error in their geography. The landing beaches were physically divided by the Selle River, a natural barrier that created a dangerous 7-mile gap between the British X Corps in the north and the US 6th Corps in the south. This wasn't just a gap on a map, it was a physical void in the Allied line. No troops held it, no tanks patrolled it. It was a vacuum. For a German commander trained in Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare, this gap was an invitation. It was an open door into the soft underbelly of the invasion force. Vietinghoff didn't just see a weakness, he saw a kill zone. He concentrated his forces with surgical precision. He didn't just throw men at the line, he massed 6 full divisions, including the 26th Panzer and the 29th Panzer Grenadier divisions, aiming them like a dagger directly at this weak point. From the hills above Paestum and Battipaglia, German artillery observers could see everything. They watched the Americans struggling to unload jeeps in the soft sand. They saw the confusion at the supply dumps. They rained accurate mortar and 88mm fire on the invaders continuously. The Americans seemed paralyzed, unable to move inland, pinned against the waterline. The psychological pressure was immense. Soldiers were digging in the sand not to advance, but just to survive the next hour. To the German observers on the peaks, the American army looked like a stranded whale, bleeding and waiting for the final blow. By September 13th, the situation for the Allies had shifted from precarious to critical. The American commander, General Mark Clark, was arguably panicked. The reports coming from his forward units were disastrous. The 36th Infantry Division was taking heavy casualties and running dangerously low on ammunition. The confusion on the beaches meant that heavy equipment, Sherman tanks, and M10 tank destroyers, was still stuck on ships or waiting in the surf, unable to deploy due to sandbars and enemy fire. Behind the front line, the beachhead did not look like a modern army. It looked like a port that had exploded. Crates marked ammunition 75mm were stacked next to food rations, medical supplies, jerry cans of fuel, even chaplain kits. Everything dumped onto the same strip of sand because there was simply no space. Bulldozers tried to carve rough tracks through the mess, but every time they opened a lane, another wave of landing craft vomited men and material into it and blocked it again. It was a traffic jam under fire. Clark's staff was already quietly drafting plans for Operation Celian, the emergency evacuation of the beachhead. This was the darkest hour of the invasion. The plan involved abandoning the southern sector entirely and transferring the 6th Corps to the British sector in the north, essentially admitting defeat in the face of the German buildup. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was active. Flying 450 sorties a day from nearby bases in Foggia, German dive bombers were pounding the landing craft and the supply dumps. Every time the sirens wailed, the men on the beach scattered, diving into shallow trenches or behind piles of crates, only to crawl out again and go back to unloading when the bombs fell somewhere else. The Germans tightened the noose hour by hour. This wasn't just about shelling, it was about psychological dominance. Vietinghoff knew that an army trapped against the sea is an army prone to panic. He ordered his units to probe aggressively, testing the American lines for the snapping point. Small groups of Panzer Grenadiers infiltrated the American positions at night, creating chaos in the rear areas. Supply trucks were ambushed. Communication lines were cut. The confusion on the beachhead was absolute. American units were landing on the wrong sectors, mixing with British units, creating a traffic jam of historic proportions. In the German headquarters, the mood was electric. They were reading the American radio traffic. They heard the frustration of the battalion commanders begging for ammunition and support that wasn't arriving. Vietinghoff sensed that the enemy was stretched to the breaking point. He decided it was time to stop probing and start destroying. He issued the order for the final breakthrough. His objective was simple: drive down the Selkalor corridor, split the Allied armies in two, and massacre them on the beaches individually. At 15:30 on September 13th, the German counterattack began. It looked exactly as Vietinghoff had planned. Panzer Thors roared out of the tree lines, their long-barreled 75mm guns smashing the light American positions. The U.S. 36th Infantry Division, overwhelmed and outgunned, began to crumble. This was the moment the Wehrmacht lived for, the Schwerpunkt, the point of maximum effort where enemy resistance snaps. German radio intercepts confirmed the panic spreading through the American lines. "Tell them to hold," an American officer screamed over the unencrypted waves. "We have nothing to stop these tanks." The German spearhead advanced 4 miles in just a few hours. They were now within sight of the sea. The tank commanders could practically smell the salt water. They saw the American logistical chaos on the beach, the piled crates, the fuel drums, the desperate men trying to dig in. There were no heavy anti-tank guns waiting for them, just soft targets. It was going to be a slaughter. The German crews loaded high-explosive shells, preparing to engage infantry and trucks. Victory was visible through their optics. They were minutes away from pushing the Americans into the water. But then, something strange happened. The forward panzer units didn't report engaging enemy tanks. They didn't report hitting minefields. They simply stopped reporting. Entire platoons of infantry vanished from the tactical net. A company of tanks attacking the warehouse district near Persano went silent in minutes. Vietinghoff at headquarters was confused. Was the resistance stiffer than expected? No. The reports that did come back were terrified and nonsensical. Veteran tank commanders, men who had fought at Kursk and El Alamein, were screaming into their radios about volcanoes erupting and steel rain. They weren't talking about tank fire. They were talking about something falling vertically from the sky. One survivor from the 16th Panzer Division later described the sound not as a whistle, but as the noise of an express train rushing directly at them. Then the earth didn't just explode. It disintegrated. Craters appeared that were big enough to swallow a Volkswagen. 30-ton tanks were being flipped upside down like toys. The German advance didn't slow down. It evaporated. A battalion of infantry moving in open formation was wiped out in seconds, not by machine guns, but by a concussion wave so powerful it ruptured lungs 300 meters away. Vietinghoff demanded answers. Where was this fire coming from? The Americans had no heavy artillery batteries deployed that far forward. The Luftwaffe reported the skies were clear of heavy bombers. The German commanders were looking for enemy tanks or artillery batteries on the ridges. They were looking in the wrong direction. 12 miles offshore, floating calmly in the Tyrrhenian Sea, was the USS Philadelphia. The USS Philadelphia was a Brooklyn-class light cruiser. She was not a soldier. She was an industrial platform designed to deliver 6-inch high-explosive shells at a rate of 120 rounds per minute. What Vietinghoff had failed to factor into his equation was a small team of men hidden in the rubble, the Shore Fire Control Party, hidden in a farmhouse or dug into a hillside overlooking the German advance. A single American lieutenant with a backpack radio was watching the German tanks. He wasn't shooting back. He was simply reading grid coordinates. To the Germans, he was just another speck of khaki in the landscape. To the Philadelphia, he was the front end of a weapon system that stretched from the Italian hills all the way back to American factories. On the Philadelphia, these coordinates were fed into a mechanical computer deep inside the ship, the Ford Mark I-A fire control computer. This was the secret weapon. It was an analog computer of brass gears and cams, a marvel of 1940s engineering. It didn't just point the guns. It calculated the ship's speed, the wind speed, the rotation of the Earth, Coriolis effect, the air density, and the temperature of the powder. Below decks, sailors in t-shirts and headphones repeated the numbers aloud as they came in, turning hand wheels and setting dials. The interior of the fire control room did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a factory floor, men at stations, each responsible for one small part of the process, trusting that the system as a whole would work. Outside, the ship rolled gently in the Tyrrhenian swell. Inside, the Ford computer removed that motion from the equation, as if the sea did not exist. It solved the differential equations of ballistics in seconds. The guns turned automatically, locked onto a target they couldn't see, controlled by a machine below decks. This was the system Vietinghoff couldn't see. At the height of the German breakthrough, the Philadelphia unleashed hell. In just a few hours, she fired 921 rounds of 6-inch ammunition directly into the German columns. One after-action report describes a single mission in which her fire, guided by a spotter, found a concentration of about 35 German tanks near one of the beaches. 7 were destroyed in minutes. The rest simply disappeared back into cover, the attack broken before it truly started. To truly appreciate why the German panzers were helpless, we have to look at the time-to-fire loop. In a traditional artillery engagement, a German forward observer would radio a battery. The battery commander would consult tables, calculate the angle, shout orders to the gun crews, and then adjust after the first spotting round. This process took anywhere from 3 to 10 minutes. Against moving tanks, 10 minutes is an eternity. By the time the shells land, the tanks are gone. The USS Philadelphia operated on a different timeline. The Ford computer was linked to a vertical stable element, a gyroscope that sensed the ship's roll and pitch. As the cruiser rocked in the waves, the computer automatically adjusted the gun barrels in real time, hundreds of times per second, to keep them locked on the geographical grid. This meant the ship could fire while turning and while moving at 20 knots, and the shells would still land within a 50-meter circle 12 miles away. From the deck, the men at the gun mounts saw only the routine. The breech opens, the shell goes in, the powder bag follows, the breech closes, the gun captain shouts, "Ready!" and the turret shakes with the recoil. But from the German perspective, that routine translated into something supernatural. Artillery that appeared to correct itself instantly, as if an invisible hand were dragging the impact point along their axis of advance. The American observer on the beach didn't have to wait for calculations. He called the grid, and 30 seconds later, the sky fell. If his first correction was off, he simply spoke again into the handset, and the next salvo walked onto the target. The Germans were not fighting human reaction times. They were fighting the processing speed of an electromechanical brain. This eliminated the concept of cover. You could not hide from a math equation that updated instantly. The violence of this bombardment created a secondary problem that Vietinghoff could never have imagined: industrial overheating. Firing 6-inch shells at rapid fire generates immense thermal energy. The barrels of the Philadelphia became so hot that the paint blistered off the steel. In a normal army, guns would cease fire to cool down, but the U.S. Navy had engineered a solution for this too. The logistics chain was designed for continuous output. As the Philadelphia depleted her magazines, firing nearly 1,000 rounds in a single engagement, she wasn't just emptying a warehouse, she was wearing out her machinery. The rifling inside the barrels began to erode from the friction of the copper driving bands on the shells. But unlike the German supply lines, which were struggling to bring single shells down the bombed Italian rail network, the Allied fleet was a floating factory. They had spare parts, spare barrels, and floating machine shops just over the horizon. There were ammunition ships assigned to keep the bombarding cruisers and battleships fed. Their captains had a simple standing order: keep the beachheads secure. Life aboard reflected this mission. Crew accounts from ships off Salerno describe days that blurred together into one continuous alarm. Air raid sirens sent men racing from mess decks to anti-aircraft stations, only to stand down and then go straight back to ammunition handling parties, feeding the main batteries. Sleep came in snatches of 20 minutes in a hot bunk, with clothes and boots on, because the next fire mission or air attack could come at any time. When a ship exhausted its capabilities, another moved into the slot. It was a conveyor belt of destruction. The Germans were fighting a finite battle with finite resources. The Allies were fighting an infinite battle with replaceable industrial components. But the Philadelphia wasn't alone. As the Germans tried to regroup, the Royal Navy joined the execution. The battleships HMS Warspite and HMS Valiant arrived on station. These ships carried 15-inch guns, weapons that fired projectiles weighing nearly 2,000 pounds. That is the weight of a small car. When Warspite opened fire, the physics of the battlefield changed. A standard German artillery shell might carry 15 pounds of explosive filler. A 15-inch naval shell carried over 100 pounds. When these shells hit the limestone terrain of Salerno, they didn't just create shrapnel, they created earthquakes. The shells came in at supersonic speeds. There was no warning whistle, just the impact. One moment, a company of panzer grenadiers was advancing. The next, a section of the grid simply ceased to exist. The psychological impact was devastating. German troops, battle-hardened veterans, broke and ran. They could fight men. They could fight tanks. They could not fight geology being rearranged around them. By September 16th, the German counterattack was broken. Vietinghoff ordered a general retreat to the Volturno line. He had not been defeated by the American infantry on the beach, who had fought bravely, but were effectively trapped. He had been defeated by the horizon. The invisible ships had created a zone of death, extending 12 miles inland, that no German armor could survive in. The dream of pushing the Allies into the sea died not with a bang, but with a realization. As long as the Allied navies controlled the water, the coast was impregnable. Salerno was a warning shot for the rest of the war. It demonstrated that the age of the independent Panzer Division was over. In the face of integrated industrial firepower, where air, sea, and land forces worked as a single machine, tactical brilliance became irrelevant. Heinrich von Vietinghoff learned, at the cost of his army, that you cannot maneuver against mathematics, you cannot outflank an industrial assembly line, and you certainly cannot win a tank battle against a ship that fires shells the size of a man from a place where you cannot touch it. Thank you for watching Tales of Valor. Please like and subscribe for more stories of the forgotten moments of World War II. Where are you watching from? What World War II stories would you like us to tell next? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light.